There are no viewers.
Yeah, I know. There might just not be any viewers, but we'll find out.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, we could talk about stuff while we're going.
What? I need to look in the camera the whole time.
No.
I'm gonna stare at myself.
Stop! Don't stare! Don't stare!
I'm
Okay.
staring at myself.
I know it's weird, but try not to stare.
I'm too beautiful.
I know you're too beautiful. I'm gonna post another thing on Facebook to tell people we're actually live. And hopefully we'll get some people, and if not, we'll just sit here for a little while. So, yeah, I mean, we could watch Adventure Time while we wait for people. See if this works at all. Like, if it's worth it to do this. Probably not, but
I think you probably should have said something about it at the shows.
yeah, I forgot about it. The thing is, I had a question card that they were supposed to hand out with the programs that had the information about it and said if you write a question down on the back of the card and hand it in to us, we'll answer it at the live stream.
But yeah, you still should have mentioned it.
Yeah, but they didn't.
At the end of each performance, you probably should have said something like, "We're doing a live stream.
Right.
Check your program for information."
Right.
Or something like that.
Yeah, no, I definitely should have.
Like, probably should have mentioned the Indiegogo campaign too.
That was also in the program.
They didn't know that.
Right. Again, if they had actually handed out programs reliably, all of that information was in the programs.
There's a viewer.
Oh, good. I wonder who it is.
Who's viewing?
Who are you?
Type in the chat.
Let me see if I can find the chat. There is a chat thing. There it is. There's nobody talking in it yet. So, I don't know if it looks the same to you as it does to us, but there's a little, on the left-hand side of the screen, there's a series of icons. One of them is chat. You can go there, type in anything you want, like a chat room, and we will see who it is. And if you have a question, there's a Q&A icon a little below the chat icon, and you type in your question, and you will answer it. So, I don't know who the viewer is, but so we're just going to sit here and stare at you until you do something.
That's right, because we don't got nothing until you ask us a question.
Right.
And quite frankly,
because it would be a little weird for us
to
just be sitting here talking to a computer and not having any idea if the person who's watching it is paying any attention.
Right. It's a little weird for you to sit and watch us, just sit here watching you.
I mean,
we can't even see you.
I mean, there is a time delay going on where it probably would have started you at the beginning, so it's probably going to be a few minutes before you get to the part where we're telling you to ask questions. So we'll just...
Wait, really?
Yeah.
You can't set it to not do that? Because this seems like exactly the wrong way to do that.
Yeah, you would think. I'm pretty sure that on their end they can decide whether they want to start at the beginning or go straight to the part that's happening now.
Oh.
But I don't think we can control that. I think it defaults to starting at the beginning.
Okay, because that sounds like the exact wrong way to do this kind of live chat thing.
It was really good for the show, for live streaming the show, because then even if they tuned in late, they still started at the beginning of the show.
Right.
But for something like this, if they actually want to participate, I think there's probably a button where you can go to the things that are happening right now. Or if you don't care...
Chat real quick. Type something in the chat.
All right.
You can type stuff into the chat.
Yes, I can.
And that should be in real time.
2 L's.
Hello.
So, but
we've never done this before. We're kind of confused.
Hopefully it'll work out, though. I mean, usually we like to do talkbacks immediately following one of the performances, because I like to give the audience a chance to ask questions. We weren't able to do that with this show because we were part of the Fringe Festival. So we figured we'd try doing this and see if it was worth it. And if not, then failed experiment, but we'll try it again next time.
We aren't the one viewer, are we?
No, because it said 0 viewers when we first got on, didn't it?
That's a good point.
And now it says 1. So there is someone else out there. We know there's someone out there. But we have no idea who it is. I don't know if we can find out who it is. Like, if they have a Google Plus name or anything. But we're looking at all the settings.
Yeah, I got nothing.
Yeah, but at the very least, assuming that somebody is watching and they're working their way up to this part, we could just start talking about the process of making the show. Can you
Have these both.
I don't know. You would think you would be able to have them both
Same
open at the same time, but apparently not. So, but
I got nothing.
but yeah, so I mean, if we want to just talk a little bit about putting the show together and any interesting challenges that we had, or kind of the results of the collaboration that we were doing. I know I've thought about this a lot, but I don't think
I have
really
not
talked about
thought
it.
about this much at all.
What was your overall impression of the show and of the whole sort of process of doing this project?
I thought it came together pretty well overall, but it had, challenges initially trying to get the gamers and the dancers working together.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
it took a while to get a full group of gamers together as well.
That's true, yeah.
I was reaching out in every way that I could think of to try and find, people who would be interested. And finally, we got, I think, Phil the first one to express interest. I think he was.
Yeah.
And then he brought Aki with him. But we didn't meet her for a while because she was out of town at the time. And then Mattia contacted me through the Facebook page.
Yeah.
And we met with him and, got to know him, and he joined the team. And then Drew was actually one of our dancers, Patty's good friend, so she told him about it, and he got in touch with us as well. So it was a process, but we did manage to get the whole group together with enough time
to
really
like
make it
work and
it was
try things out.
I know it was certainly an interesting experience for dancers, because when we started the project, none of the dancers knew anything about Dungeons and Dragons or even role-playing games in general. And I had the initial concept for reasons that I was really interested in, but we quickly determined that it would be the most effective if the dancers understood sort of the process and what was going on. So we really brought them in and we gave them some of the information. Oh, that's Mom.
Oh.
Sure. So, yeah, let me do this. So I'm going to select this one. There we go. So this is my mom. Hi, Mom. And she wants to know if we want her to ask us a question. So, of course we do. So if you have a question about the show or anything that was brought up through watching the show or hearing us talk about it, let us know. We'll be happy to answer it.
There's also a chat thing on the left-hand side, too.
Should be on the left-hand side. I don't actually know what this looks like from the other end. I only know what it looks like from our end. So if you just want to chat more real-time, with the questions thing, we can put it up like this so that everyone can see which question we're answering. But we're still going to have to say what the question is for people who are watching this later on. So, but yeah, we would be happy to answer any questions you have. But yeah, I felt it was very important to have the dancers understand at least a little bit about the game itself and sort of how it was functioning. So we brought them in right from the beginning of the character creation process. They created their own characters. The characters that were in the show were actually the dancers rolled for the values of the different stats and determined which numbers went into which stats based on what I had told them about how we were translating each stat into dance. Let's see. How many scenarios did Josh make, and did you repeat any of them from the rehearsals? That's a question for you.
Oh, I made, how many scenarios did I make? I made 5 scenarios.
5 for the show.
5 for the show, and then in rehearsal I had made 3 total for rehearsals, and we didn't use any of the ones from rehearsals in the show.
Right. We had one scenario that we used in 2 rehearsals consecutively because we had kind of half the company at one rehearsal and then the other half at the other rehearsal, so it was new to the players. We had a couple of dancer overlaps, but we had half of the players one day, and the other half the other day, so he reused the same scenario for that one.
Yeah, we wanted to make sure that each run of it was completely new to the players and the dancers, because that was an important aspect of sort of role playing in general, that the players generally don't know what the plan is, and so they have to respond in real time, and we wanted to sort of simulate that.
Yeah, there were a lot of things where in an actual game the players would not have been told things that they were told in the dance just because the dancers needed to know. For example,
although not much.
Not much. There were a few like skill checks in dungeon sections and things like that frequently they would tell the DM what they had rolled, but the DM wouldn't specifically tell them whether that was a success or a failure.
Right.
They would just tell them what that roll said in terms of story. So, things like finding out that you failed the roll and don't see any traps is very different than just finding out that you don't see any traps.
Right.
So there was some of that. The distinctions between different kinds of scenes was also a little bit more specific than it would have been in a real game.
Yeah, and the dancers knew what scenes were coming up, but they didn't know what was going to happen in those scenes.
We had cheat sheets for the dancers because they had a lot to think about. That basically said, this is the scenario, here are the 3 types of scenes, and this is the order they go in, and just a little bit about when those things transition. Like, okay, they get thrown in jail, that's the end of the scenario. That was one we didn't end up doing. But we wanted to make sure that the dancers knew enough that they didn't feel lost, but at the same time the players weren't in on things that they wouldn't normally have been in on.
Right.
So we do have 2 scenarios that Josh made for the show that we didn't end up using. Because even during the last show, we still wanted to have options for the players to choose from. So, what was I'll just sort of follow up on this. What was the scenario creation process like for you? How would you say that it differed from normal DMing, like character creation or scenario creation?
It really didn't differ that much from how I normally do things. The only challenge that it had was trying to make sure that everything was short, because usually D&D adventures are longer than what we did by a lot, a very lot, and then trying to separate it out into 3 distinct scenes. There were a lot of ideas that I had that would have been interesting scenarios, but wouldn't have fit into the social dungeoneering or combat categories so well.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of the ideas I had initially involved a fight that goes into a talking section and then goes back into a fight,
mm-hmm. Which are really interesting and exciting to play.
Right, but would have been more difficult to manage in the show.
Yeah.
Particularly with music changing and having the
mm-hmm.
dance change and everything.
Well, and even I feel like the process of us coming to the decision that there were 3 different kinds of scenarios, that was a process that you and I sat down for a long time and talked about how we could sort of classify anything that could conceivably be happening in a game into one of a few different categories.
Yeah, well, I still think those categories apply. It's just most sessions weave in between those categories
mm-hmm.
a lot more freely.
Yeah. Well, and I think as we continued to work on it, it became more and more about...
And we even still had some places where there was, talking to an NPC during a dungeoneering section, which was dungeoneering, but was also social in mm-hmm. some ways.
Well, and I think, like I was going to say, I think as we started to work on it, it turned more into really the biggest distinction is combat versus not combat. And that, not being in combat, there are a couple of different ways it can go. We decided to go very simple with the dance scores for non-combat things so that if moments like that happened, it would be relatively easy for us to kind of weave in and out of them. But yeah, no, you had a different scenario for every rehearsal that we did,
mm-hmm.
Which was great. We did some fun stuff in rehearsals. And
a lot of that was mentioned. There was mention mm-hmm. of many of those in the shows. Whenever Percy had mentioned how many goblins they had fought, that mm-hmm. was actually in rehearsal.
Right.
Or the talk of Tiny, their giant intern,
who was during the tech rehearsal that we had the Thursday before the show.
The other one didn't get mentioned that much. It was more raunchy and
it was a little more PG-13 than we really wanted to go.
And so I don't think anybody wanted to bring it up.
Probably not, but it was really interesting to have so much rehearsal time and allow those sorts of stories to come up. Did I choreograph anything that never came up in the game? Oh yeah, tons of stuff. We actually originally
know what stuff that she did choreograph. I didn't see many of the rehearsals.
We simplified everything a lot. We originally started with 5 different kinds of social scenario. I had this idea to do it depending on what kind of conversation was going on. So we had a phrase for arguments, we had a phrase for interrogation, we had a phrase for small talk, and we played with that a little bit, but it turned out to be just too hard to react to what was going on and too hard to figure out what kind of conversation this qualified as.
Right. And conversations would shift between them.
They would shift between them a lot. We found that we were using one of our scores way more than the other one, and that was sort of the just catch-all. We're just talking about stuff, trying to figure things out as a group. And that was what eventually became what we call the red die building phrase, which is what we decided to stick with for social in general, which was the idea that we kind of trade off the red foam die, and whoever's holding it is building the shapes from our phrase, from our basic social phrase, until someone steals the die from them. And we found ourselves doing that more than anything else, so we decided to just simplify it. We did still bring in the explanation phrase as part of the prologue. We brought in the call and response, which was our small talk phrase, was part of the prologue as well. It was the 2 duets in the prologue that alternated people, because we really liked that, and we didn't have a place to put it in the social section. It was too hard to figure out when it was happening. So we stuck some of that into the prologue because the prologue was completely set choreographically. We didn't start responding to the game until we had finished our sort of opening set. But yeah, there was a lot of that, mostly in the social sections. There was a lot of sort of half-baked ideas that never really went anywhere. We also, at one point, we ditched the social phrase itself and just combined it with the dungeoneering phrase, and then we sort of put it back at the end a little bit. The social, for each of the 3 sections, I had a base movement phrase that I choreographed and set on everyone that we were working on. And the social and the dungeoneering were 2 sides of the same coin. It was the same choreography, but we put different meanings to all of the movements. So in the social phrase, there was a movement that was clinking goblets and taking a drink from a goblet in a tavern. When we moved to the dungeoneering phrase, it was the same movement, but it became flat. It became sort of shining a torch into the corners of the room. So it was the same movements, but with some slight changes and a different intention. And everybody really seemed to like the dungeon version of that phrase more than the social one. So for a while, we were sort of opening it up and allowing them to use the dungeon phrase in social scenes. So it ended up being a combination of both. But so it did, and the social phrase did still make an appearance, but it was downplayed a lot. There were a couple of, everything goes through iterations, but as far as things that just didn't make it in, there were a lot of different social scenes that didn't make it in. And then, luck of the draw, some of the runs didn't have bits and pieces in them, depending on what the scenario was. Mm-hmm. One of the things, in the combat, we originally had this big supported fall to the floor that was supposed to be the resolution of every dice roll, that whoever won would take the other person to the floor. That turned out to be too much to do constantly, so we amended it and said we only do that for critical success or critical failure. So that happened a couple of times in the 5 o'clock show on Saturday, I think. But other than that, that one didn't show up, just because nobody rolled criticals. There were a few different kinds of ideas that we had that sort of hung around but never really got used. We had a lot of ideas for what to do if the game kind of went off the rails, but the more the players rehearsed, the better they got at preventing it from going off the rails in the first place. So we ended up not needing to use a lot of that.
Yeah, that was actually what we started announcing. Mm-hmm. It was part of the reason why we started announcing the sections.
Yeah.
Initially we were going to do that with just music, but we started announcing, like, we're moving into a social scene, moving into a dungeoneering scene, partially so the dancers knew what was going on, and also so the players could play along.
Right. There was a certain amount.
And not go off the rails.
There was a certain amount of just humor the DM and play along because of how little time we had.
Right. In one of the rehearsals, we went completely off the rails.
That was the first one that we all did together, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the first complete run-through we did.
The first full run-through we did all the way together. We were supposed to have a dungeon. It had 2
social scenes and didn't have the dungeon.
There was supposed to be a dungeon after the social scene, but the social scene turned into an interrogation and didn't have a dungeon. And so we adapted and it ran just fine, but that run didn't have a dungeon scene in it. And so that led us to start talking about, how much do we want to direct the players to make sure that we get one of everything.
Right. And we decided that was important. We needed to start doing that.
Which I think in retrospect it was important, because those 3 different types of scenarios had very different feels and very different scores, and the dance looked very different. So it was definitely important, I think, that a little bit of each one showed up.
Right.
And it didn't have to be much. Particularly in these shows, the combats kind of went downplayed.
I was actually surprised that the combat didn't take as long as it usually does in a D&D game. Mm-hmm. Actually, the dungeoneering sections were the ones that ended up taking the longest.
Well, the dungeoneering sections, I think, required the players to actually solve puzzles. Which, for a combat scene, they knew that they were on a time limit, so they were sort of solidifying a couple of things that their character does a lot and just making a decision about what they were going to do quickly. And not doing too much extraneous, I want to do something weird and I don't really know how to do this kind of things. But for the dungeoneering sections, the enchanted doors, man. Yeah. Apparently, this party's Achilles' heel is enchanted doors because
doors with riddles.
Doors with riddles took them a really long time. And you mentioned something a couple days ago when we were talking about it, about how puzzles are harder to solve with more people in the pod.
Yeah, because everybody likes to get in the way of it. Everyone gets in the way of what is maybe an obvious answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and frequently they would come up and, for some of them I knew what the answer to the riddle was. Some of the time I had sort of looked at Josh's notes and sometimes I hadn't. But for the one in the 5 o'clock Saturday show, which was the Tomb, I had looked at his cheat sheet and I had seen that the answer to the puzzle was simply a lawful character has to stand on the correct button on the floor.
Right, whereas they thought that the text on the door.
Well, they had a couple of different problems going.
Was a hint telling them what the solution was, not telling them who could answer the solution.
I feel like, because I was in the middle of it and I was listening to the conversation, and I feel like they had too many variables going.
Right, it was a far more simple puzzle.
The answer
than they were making it to be.
A lawful character needs to stand on the correct answer, and the only lawful character in the party was Aki. So really, the answer is Aki needs to do this. But what they had they ended up going off on the wrong path to begin with, and thinking that it had something to do with everyone needing to stand on the buttons or needing to press the buttons in the right order. So they sort of latched onto the idea that all 4 buttons needed to get pressed at some point, rather than just that they had to pick the right one.
Right.
And so the electric shock that they would get when they did something wrong, they started to think of as a thing that needed to happen, that they had to get shocked a certain number of times, as opposed to it just means that's wrong. So I do think there is that sort of factor. The more people you have, the more people you have trying to solve the problem, the longer it takes to solve the problem.
Right.
But I thought that was really interesting, and I didn't really feel like it went on for too long. I did get worried during the door puzzle in the show that I was like, this is going on for a really long time.
Well, it seemed like they were reaching it, and
right.
And I mean, I was going to eventually start giving them hints if it was taking too long.
Exactly. So. But yeah, so there was, a lot of it was having contingencies for things that may or may not ever actually go anywhere. Group of players, do you think you'll do more with them? We had a good group of players, do we think we'll do more with them? Well, let you answer that one first.
Yeah, we're I don't know about doing more with them in relation to Geek Stance and performances. That's a question for her, but we're certainly going to try to keep that group of players together and that group of characters and that sort of just that game going. Yeah. We are certainly going to try to do that. Everyone was interested in doing that, and I'm interested in continuing that. They now have a good history with a number of different adventures under their belt, even if they're not big, long adventures.
Right. And I feel like the way that we were structuring this, they had a lot of very short adventures, which we were talking about over the weekend too, that it gives more context to them as a group in a very short period of time. As far as
which is interesting, because I've never done that as a DM, and I've never been in a game that's done anything like that. Right. It's always been
one-offs.
The characters, they're not one-offs, the characters start along this epic campaign. It's never been one small one-off after another to sort of build a group cohesion.
Well, and to give them a lot of
scenarios,
references to draw from. Things like Tiny the Giant Intern, or the kobolds who are back at the tavern counting money.
Right.
That all of those were things that happened in previous sessions. So having a lot of short sessions allowed them to behave more like a group that had been role-playing for a lot longer than they had as a unit.
Yeah.
As far as whether we'll do anything with them with Geek Stance, it kind of depends on whether there's a opportunity for us to do this project again or another D&D related project again. I mean, I never have any aversion to redoing pieces that we've already done. It's a question of whether there's interest in it, whether people seem excited about it. What I like about projects like this, and actually the math dance that I did in college was like this, that dances like this that have a very clear sort of process base I really enjoy getting to reset those and redo those, because essentially what we would do is just use the same procedure and maybe make new characters, start out with a different group of dancers who have different aesthetic qualities that they value. Use that to create new movement material but keep the same structure and the same kind of rationale for how we do which things we do. And if there were a chance for us to do that, we probably would reach out to the same group again, I think, because they already get the differences that they had to do and the kind of hoops that they had to jump through to make the show work.
Yeah.
Because there was some timing stuff that is a little less natural for a role player. But I mean, I would be more.
Yeah, and waiting to announce results is really hard for hard for us role players. We like to roll dice and immediately announce it.
And that was by far the biggest.
Or immediately cover our shame when we roll poorly.
Right. Well, and we talked about this too, that I liked the reactions to the dice rolls happening immediately, naturally when they did. And it was just a question of waiting for the dance to get to the decision point before telling the audience whether it was a success or a failure. I mean, if you are making an important roll and you roll 3, obviously it's a failure. Everyone at the table knows it's a failure.
Yes.
But the audience can't see the dice, so they don't necessarily know that. So it was just a question of let the reaction happen, but then wait until the dance gets to where it needs to be before you tell the audience what you were cracking up about.
Right.
But yeah, I would love to work with them again. We're, like Josh said, we're definitely interested in keeping the game going. And I'm going to jump in as a player in that game because I love to play. And I was sort of sitting and observing the sessions that they were running as rehearsals, and felt really weird and awkward sitting at the table and not participating and just watching. But yeah, they were a very good group of players, and I think too they became a very tight group of players, and they didn't start out necessarily that way. They kind of all came at it from different directions, but they were actually pretty easily able to kind of figure out their characters and figure out the dynamic in the group and really bring it together into a group that sounded like they've been playing together for years. Aki and Phil knew each other and had played together before, but Mattia and Drew were completely new to the group.
Not that they were new to role-playing.
But they were, we had basically 3 different groups of people coming together, 4 if you count us. And, none of them had ever played in a game that Josh was DMing before, so they had to get used to his style of running a game and that sort of thing.
Right, and we had a game going. We had this group of players playing with the characters they use in the show outside of the dance, outside of rehearsals. Yeah. So we kind of had our own rehearsals where we were playing, just playing Pathfinder.
Rehearsals, quote unquote. They were just D&D sessions essentially.
Yeah.
But we had started them with the thought that the players would be able to benefit from having some time to play together, which we definitely think.
Yeah, that definitely helped.
It definitely helped, and it was. I would say it was noticeable as an observer just from the first session that we did with everyone to the way they were behaving at the show. It was much more natural at the show. So it was definitely a good group, and a lot of the things that came up in their rehearsal sessions eventually made it into some of our promotional material. We had our friend Alex Mitchell, who does wonderful illustrations and loves to do character illustrations. did the artist's renderings of the various characters, and those were drawn partially from the individual players' descriptions of their characters, but partially just from my comments to him about the way that they've been behaving in sessions. And so that sort of informed them and informed the way that we promoted the show, and the sorts of things that we talked about on the Facebook page and things like that. I got very into the idea of overheard at rehearsal and posting a little random out of context comment that somebody had mentioned during a session, which is the great part about this kind of game, is that you do get really great interactions with people that may not make a whole lot of sense out of context, but certainly make you interested to know where it was going or what was happening. So yeah, we're definitely gonna keep playing with them at the very least, and if it seems like a thing that we want to have happen again, I would definitely reach out to that group again. The only issue I could see with that would just be it was very difficult to schedule 10 people all in the same place at the same time. So it would have to be, there would be a lot of planning involved in it. It's the kind of thing we could probably do on shorter notice because we already have the whole idea of how the dance goes, and it's so much improvised that we wouldn't really need to rehearse it all that much. Mm-hmm. But getting everybody in the same place at the same time, even just twice or 3 times to go over things, would be a challenge.
That was a challenge for us to get everybody together in one place.
It was a challenge for us to get everyone together all at the same time, as it was, and that was the reason for the partial rehearsals that we were having towards the end with, 2 players and 3 dancers one day, and then 2 players and 1 dancer the next day. So we kind of fudged it and made it work however we could. But yeah, I would definitely be interested in doing the project again and working with that group of players again.
I think that'd be fun.
And like I said, probably what I would do is re-choreograph new phrases, new bass phrases for each of the sections, and have people make new characters so that the dancers have different stats and are doing their phrase differently now. And that would completely change the appearance of the dance while not having to redo any of the complicated stuff to give us what we were doing. So that was another fun part of the process for me, was the character creation aspect of it, and the idea that I knew I wanted the dancers to create the characters based on what kind of movement they like to perform. So the 6 basic stats in Dungeons and Dragons, in the game they sort of tell you little things about who your character is as far as personality, or skills or strengths, that sort of thing. And so I took each of those and sort of translated it into what would a dance that was high in that characteristic use? What would that be high in? A good example is strength turned into lots of big jumps and big turns and just moving really big. Patty and Lamar both had very high strength because they love to move big. Constitution, which was the thing that made Patty's phrase stand out from everybody else's, we decided was balance and stamina. So lots of very deep lunges, lots of very slow balances, things that required a lot of stamina to maintain. Intellect and wisdom we used to be the ways that they incorporated movements of their own and movements from other people. So with those sorts of things in mind, I had them do their dice rolls to determine the numbers, and then allocate the numbers in whatever way they wanted. And then at the time we had all the dancers around the table, and we had Josh and Phil were the only people we had at the time. Mm-hmm. So that was right at the beginning of the process. And so Josh and Phil were sort of helping them through the intricacies of the character process and
Yeah.
helping them sort of determine what race and what class those stats made sense as.
Mm-hmm.
And we got to the point of, okay, this is a dwarf barbarian, okay, this is an elf rogue. And then by that point, we had the rest of our players lined up. And so we just sort of handed them the stack of character sheets and said, here are your characters, take the one you want, and then try and make it your own. So we ended up with, I would say, an unusual group.
Yeah.
In terms of just character makeup and
character
abilities.
makeup and stat distributions.
Yeah, I mean, we ended
I'm sure it had to have been a little weird for the players to be handed the main aspects of their character,
right,
and then sort of fill in the blanks after that.
Mm-hmm.
I know that would be weird for me as a
player. I could see it would be weird for me as well, and that was part of sort of the idea, the experiment of it was, this is what the dancers want to play.
Right.
You know, how is that different from what a player would want to play?
Right.
Lamar played a bard. Lamar's bard had the highest strength in the party, which is not something that generally happens for a bard. They're usually kind of squishy. But, you know...
Well, he is still kind of squishy. He just hits things hard.
He just hits things really hard. So they had very strange assortments of stats, and then there was a really interesting process of I think, for the players trying to rationalize what all of that meant in terms of a character.
Right.
So I thought that was a really interesting process for me, and I enjoyed that part. So I would want to do that part again if we were to do another round of the show.
Mm-hmm.
I would want to do the character creation again. And maybe, you know, maybe the next time it would be we have the players just make characters and then hand those to the dancers and give them the task of translating the different stats that they're seeing into types of movement, or, you know, hand the group of dancers the stack of characters and have them allocate them depending on which dancer is good at which things. You know, which I think was definitely a real key factor in them choosing where they put their stats. So it would be interesting to be handed a set of stats that was already prepared and say, okay, this one has a lot of constitution. I don't want to do all of that. How do you do it? You know, so that would be fun.
Right.
I would enjoy that. But, yeah. I don't think there's anything else. Anything else that would be interesting?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Yeah. I don't know. But it was a really fun process, and it was a lot of experimenting and really interesting, just very interesting creative process, I think. And I feel like we all informed each other a lot. That the players informed the dancers' movements, and the dancers informed some of the ways that the players, worked out their personalities.
Yeah.
Even some pairings that I didn't anticipate working nearly as well as they did. I was not anticipating Natia and Lamar
working together very well.
Yeah. My original thought, because the dancers were 3 girls and a guy, and the players were 3 guys and a girl, was to do a gender swap thing where, Lamar and Aki would be together. So they would all be playing someone of the opposite gender, or have, just there would be a nice symmetry to that. And then when the first time that we got together, the players had already sort of half assigned who was doing what, and they had assigned them that way. Based on, I think, probably which class they wanted to play, I would imagine.
Yeah.
But so we had some really interesting interactions just between unlikely pairs that I think all ended up working out really well. They had a nice sort of meshing of personalities.
Yeah.
I think, which I wasn't necessarily expecting from all of them. but they did definitely work themselves out in a way that I can't even really imagine now. Any of them playing opposite people, like I can't imagine Aki and Lamar together now that the show has happened.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It would be odd.
I think part of it too was that Aki and Drew, I believe, were newer to the game.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes.
So, like, Aki is very quiet. She doesn't say much. And, I'm that same sort of person when I'm playing, and I wasn't really ever sure if it was a conscious choice because her character doesn't say much, or if she was just not as outspoken of a player in the group. I think it was probably a little bit of both.
Right.
But that meshed very nicely with Jackie's sort of also very calm demeanor. Mattia apparently is always the player who just suggests very strange things all the time, and that went very nicely with Lamar, who is kind of a wild card. And Patty and Phil, which I still really wish Patty had gotten to be in the show, because Patty and Phil had like the best tag team interaction in rehearsals that really sold the show. And actually, to her credit, Jackie did a really good job of bringing that to the way that she was playing Honora. And I think on some level she realized, like, okay, I'm playing Patty. I've got to be the one who banters back and forth with the players a lot.
Right, because Patty did that a lot.
Because Patty did that a lot. Yeah, Patty was always the one, making comments while the players were doing things, or heckling them, poking fun at them while they were playing. Drew and Angelina are both relatively soft-spoken as well, but in a slightly different way. So I think it ended up working out really well. I find my group of dancers to be really fascinating because of the way that they interact with the additional people that I bring to the process. I was talking about this with our new storyteller for the Halloween show, because I felt very similarly about the way that they brought Alan Irvin, our storyteller from last year's Halloween show, into the group when we started working together. That Alan, is kind of struck me as kind of shy, and they really managed to just sort of grab him by the hand and pull him into the group and just make him part of the group and start giving him hugs and heckling him and just, really going out of their way to make him part of the company. And I feel like they did a very similar thing with the players.
Yeah, I agree.
And really make it feel like we are one group. We're not two separate groups anymore. That, we all have an equal share in creating this thing that we're working on. So I think it's hard to be detached from the group when Lamar is up in your face, like, getting you to dance.
Right, it's true.
And the first time that we were all in the same place at the same time was the photo shoot.
Yeah.
Because that was, like, the first time we had met Aki, really. Yep. And it was the first time that the players and the dancers really spent any time together. And one of the first things that we did in the photo shoot were the duet shots of the one player and their corresponding dancer. And the direction I gave them for that was just players sitting on the box. You have the die, big foam die in your hands. The dancer is going to go through their phrase and attempt to get the die from you, and you have to keep it out of their reach. And that, I think, went a long way towards sort of bonding those pairs.
Yeah.
Even at that very early stage when they didn't really know where they were going with any of it.
Well, and each of them definitely had a different way of approaching that whole thing.
And I think I still remember Lamar just, like, climbing all over Mattia to try and get to the die.
Yeah.
I think he startled Mattia a little bit. But at the same time, I think that probably informed the way that Mattia chose to play that character as well. So I think that was a really interesting way to kind of bring the group together.
Yeah.
For the first time. with this idea of playing Keep Away, which I'm also really glad made it into the show, because that idea wasn't originally anywhere in the show. I just thought it would make some cool pictures. And we ended up sort of doing that with the social scenes, with the dancers sort of stealing the red dye from each other. We kind of started doing that in rehearsal a few weeks before the show, and it really like clicked with everyone when we were going through it and we started playing with that. Or someone would have the dye and they'd do this big movement with their arm and then they'd drop it, just as someone else was coming up to grab it, and they'd have to go chasing after it. And it really, really sort of hit home, I think, for all of us. And so I was very happy that made it into the show.
From the player side, it looked like once you made that change, the social scenes were much more animated and lively.
Definitely.
Not that we could see very well because we were role-playing. But
there was a lot during the process that the social scenes were like my sticking point during the process. I was very worried about them. Just because I couldn't figure out what to do with them. They were so... anything could happen kind of thing. Right. There was a lot less structure in the game. And since my basic concept was to have the dance reflect the game mechanics as opposed to the story.
Right, there's almost never game mechanics.
There's really no game mechanics in social because that's where the story gets created. Right. So trying to come up with something to do that seemed like it made sense and seemed like it was connected to what was going on at the table. But there was no game mechanic to work with. So that took a long time for me to figure out. But once we started playing with that idea of dropping the die and hiding the die from each other and stealing it from each other, I think we kind of got into this playful mode. And it started to become, the kind of working formula for both dungeoneering and, hey, look, Phil's here. For both the dungeon scenes and the social scenes, the kind of working formula for us was, if your player is talking, you should be the one moving. Very roughly. And it didn't really work out that way all the way through, especially in the social scenes, but I feel like what we got was a real sense of the kind of emotion or the playfulness behind the social scenes. The little bit of bantering that goes back and forth and just kind of poking fun at each other that happens. So Phil just showed up in the chat room.
There he's back.
Oh, he said he's too... you're not too late, Phil.
Well,
am I too late? No, you're not too late, actually. We were just talking...
I think he's having problems staying connected, though.
Yeah, I don't know if we were going to try and figure out if we could add him to the hangout, so that we could show him as well, but I don't know if we can do that. I don't know. I have no clue. I'm not really sure how that would work. So we can put him in the chat room, probably, and we can ask Phil questions. And we can just stare and wait for Phil to answer us questions. Right. Let me see if I can figure this out. Excuse me for 1 second. Invite people. I think invite people would invite them to the...
Try it. See what happens.
Snyder.
I think that's just going to invite him to the link.
Possibly. But I don't really know. That might invite him to the actual... So I know there is a way to put more than one screen in the Hangout, I just don't know what it is yet. But Phil was going to come and be here in this room with us. But I don't know. So, I mean, we might be able to, like, click on him. Click on his icon down there and see if it shows him. Yeah, it looks like if you set up his camera, we would be able to see him. But for right now, I would say, Phil, you can just, if you want to answer or add anything to the things we're talking about, you can just go into the chat panel and just throw your 2 cents in. we were just talking about. We were talking about a lot of things. What were we talking about most recently?
I don't know.
I was talking about the trying to figure out what to do with the social scenes, but yeah, I guess. Phil, if you want to share.
Oh, I heard you.
Oh, hey, we've got sound. What?
Um,
Oh, there we
I
go.
got video. We can
I
see you.
might be doing stuff.
It looks like we can
Looks
flip
like we
between
can
you
flip
two.
between the two of us. Okay, so currently the only other person on the live stream is my mom, asking all kinds of great questions. But if you know, he's here.
Hello?
No.
Hey,
Hello? I can't see anything anymore.
no.
Oh, can you see stuff now?
No.
No.
Oh God, there it is.
Oh, yeah. Because I think if we switch the
If we
stream to
switch the
you,
stream
you
to
just
you
don't
and
get to
you
see
show
anything.
up, that's really weird because we're seeing ourselves right now. Okay.
Yeah, I'm seeing you.
So we'll just leave it on here because we can actually see you moving in the little icon, so we'll be able to handle this. But if you want to say anything, definitely chime in.
Absolutely.
I guess my first question for you, Phil, then, since we have you here, is what were your impressions of this project from the player side? Because we've talked a lot about being on the sort of creative end of it. So, as someone who was playing and participating that way, did you have any interesting thoughts that you wanted to share about the experience itself?
Well, excuse me. The big thing was A, getting to know the rest of the players, and B, of course, getting to know the dancers. And what really helped was that we were all here for the story. I mean, it wasn't, all right, I'm going to grandstand, and look at how awesome my character is, and crazy, I've got plus 80 to this thing, and I'm going to take this
like that
off the rails and like go.
Yeah, and I think I certainly felt like everyone was in it for the project and the experience.
Yeah.
What the thing could be. So, to hear from your end, what did you like about the project? What did you find most unusual, unexpected?
I liked everything about it. It was fantastic. I mean,
good.
Saying, oh, I liked playing the game. Well, I love D&D. Josh, it was great.
Right.
It was fantastic. But seeing the things happen. My friends that were there, they loved it. It's very interesting because I mean, there's the narrative that we have as gamers, and whether that narrative is just straight theater of imagination, or whether it's on the minis, and however you tell the story, it's there. This was a completely new way to see what was going on, and that was really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's what we've been talking about a little bit earlier. The idea that I made a very choice to want to have the dance reflect the game, and connects the nuts and bolts of putting the game together, as opposed to the story. Because you're right. You don't need me, essentially. Like, you don't need us to tell the story for you. What we were attempting, at least, and it seemed like it was fairly successful at it, was to sort of illustrate how you guys were determining what direction the story was going. That a lot of that was happening by dice rolls, like the sort of showcase. Well, okay, he failed a check. His dancer's going to the floor now, and then at the table they're going to rationalize what that meant in terms of story.
Mm-hmm.
So Yeah, so definitely, I mean, we had fun.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I would just, I guess let's ask Phil about character creation, since he was on the receiving end of it.
Yeah.
What was the experience of being handed like a half-finished character and told to
Fleshing it out.
turn that into an actual character? What was that experience?
It's not for everybody. I will say that.
Certainly.
But honestly, I'm fine with it. I mean, this is not the first time that I was handed a character and said, "All right, go," and not even like random pre-gens. Not the most recent Nerd Pit, but the one prior. There was a game. My buddy Strauss was running it. A girl who started the game was like, "All right, I've got this female rogue. I'm halfway into the game. I'm going to be leaving soon." Like, "Oh my God, Strauss, you're running this awesome game. Can I get in?" He's like, "Yeah, sure." This is all I have. I'm like, "Done. Fine. What do I need to know?"
Right.
Well, she's this. She's this. She doesn't like that guy. Just roll with it. And it was fantastic. I had a blast. Everyone was like, "Oh my God, Phil, I've never seen you play a female before. This is weird, and you did really, really good."
Yeah, that's another thing we might want to talk about at some point. I tend to try to shy away from discussing gender things because I don't really care that much.
Right.
But there certainly is something to be said for the fact that half of the table was cross-playing and the other half was not.
Yeah.
And just what that dynamic is like. I mean, to be fair, Mom does play WoW, so there is certainly that culture of sometimes you just want to play someone who is not your gender.
Of course, yeah.
But I feel like the way that you sort of approach that kind of experience is very different. So I did think it was really interesting that the way that the characters ended up getting divvied up, we had kind of two of each.
Yeah.
So we had the more natural pairings and then the pairings you had to think about for a minute. So
we're constantly confusing my pairs.
Right, exactly. This is a running joke now. But I guess my other question then would be, what was it like sharing a character with a dancer? Kind of having two people playing the same character from different angles. What was that experience like?
It wasn't all that different than having a character that's your own. It's just, honestly, I mean, it's kindergarten, and you learn to share your toys with other people.
Right.
And even though Patty wasn't there, she was just as invested as I was in what Honora was doing. Things that she did, how well she rolled, who she took crap from and who she didn't. So, there's that dynamic there between dancer and player, which is very nice. I mean, it's not something that would work all the time for every game, but I love the fact that it worked as well as it did between the dancers and the players.
Right.
Definitely.
Because, like I said, the dancers making the characters first. That got them involved. That got them hooked in.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
The players, taking those characters and going, "Okay, you've given us this rough shape. We are going to chip off the edges, sand it down, put a fine polish on it,
right.
And then we can both look at it and go, yeah, this is something that we did." And it was weird because I've never dual wielded.
Right.
I've never done that before, but it was awesome.
Played a character with somebody else.
Yeah.
Well, because everything that she was doing, Patty and Jackie were both going to be doing. So, it was good. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, that I think was something that I thought was a really interesting kind of phenomenon because I knew going into it that I wanted the dancers to be the ones who allocated the stats to the character.
Mm-hmm.
Because A, it would get them more involved, like you were saying, but also it would sort of showcase in a way the qualities that a dancer would find useful. You know, that being in the little bit of D&D that I've been in, there's sort of this conception of like, oh, okay, if you have these two stats with lots of points in them, you're this kind of person.
Yeah.
And so I liked the idea of like, okay, well, let's ignore all of that and just hand a group of dancers, you know, a list of stats that say these are the qualities that could be heightened or diminished. What do you want to do with it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and ending up with things like Lamar's Bard, who had an enormously high strength and also an enormously high intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, would not necessarily have been anyone's first choice for a character just setting out to make the game.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
I did think it was very interesting, just seeing kind of the process that the players were taking of transferring that into something that made sense in the context that you guys were creating. So that was really interesting to me. And we were talking about if we were ever to do this project again, I think it would have to start with another round of character creation, because that was one of the coolest parts about it.
Another
round
what was it?
of character creation.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, just start over with new characters, and kind of do that process maybe backwards, and have the players create their characters and then hand them to the dancers and say, all right, who wants which part? You know, because I found that sort of balance to be really interesting, and I suspected that those sort of traits that would be valued wouldn't necessarily line up.
Yeah.
You know, player benefits versus dancer benefits wouldn't necessarily come out to be the same thing. But I thought it was really interesting how the process of kind of rationalizing why those stat choices were made after the fact was really fascinating. So,
it might also be easier if you did it that way, to put a little bit more nuance on the dancer's part.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, because the way we did it, they sort of created a bare bones structure, and then the players refined it. But I don't think that there was much reflection of the refinements in the dance itself. And maybe if we did it backwards, it'd be easier to sort of put some of those like specifics in, like, well, I'm a rogue that has a high dexterity, but I'm also using ranged weapons, and I have these feats that represent that.
Right. Yeah. It would be interesting if we were to do the project again to kind of try to go a little deeper into things like that.
Obviously, you can't go too deep and get too confusing.
I mean, kind of my name of the game for this round was the dancers have way too much to think about as it is.
Right.
But, like, for example, I thought about this towards the end of the process, but we already had so much on our minds that I just sort of ignored it. Some of the stats kind of got lost when the dancers refined their phrases.
Right.
Specifically, I think charisma got lost, because the dance equivalent of charisma was level of focus. Higher charisma was a more external focus, communicating more directly with the audience. Lower charisma was supposed to be more internal, kind of in your own bubble focus. And with so much else to think about, that kind of got lost. With a lot of dancers. And the wisdom and intelligence were there, but they were harder to see as well.
Right.
They were actually directly influencing the structure of the tag that each dancer made to stick on the end of the phrase. And how long it was, and how many movements it had, and how many of them they made up versus how many of them they stole from other dancers.
Right.
So you could kind of see it in that some of them had longer tags than others, but the exact details of it kind of got lost. So, you know, that's something that we might play with if we did it again. But certainly, I think that whole process was really fascinating to me. And just getting to
I agree.
with everyone else.
Excuse me.
So, um, anything that you wanted to players perspective on?
That's really it. That was the main thing I was curious about.
Yeah. I guess I would also wonder if you can talk a little bit about the sort of levels of awareness in terms of trying to complete the session in the hour, of
yeah.
time.
Yeah.
We had talked a little bit about how the players kind of had to play along to a certain extent.
Oh, absolutely.
Not go too crazy, and so I think it would be interesting to see what was your perception of the
hour limit.
that kind of needing to be aware of that while you were still playing.
Well, honestly, I mean, looking at the hour limit, that and I just looked at it as running a game at a convention. I mean, conventions, yeah, they're longer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're typically, like 4 hours at the very least.
Yeah.
So, just knowing that, hey, yeah, sorry, I have a cat. Just knowing that, all right, we only have an hour, and knowing that an hour in any type of RPG doesn't mean much.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's focus. You get in there, you do what you need to do, and then you get out. I mean, it's not that taciturn,
Right.
but at the same time, it's very much you need to keep your head in the game. Not shop talk, not side talk,
And not do something random that the DM would not have been prepared for.
Exactly. I mean, and heck, you've seen the games that we ran leading up to it, Josh.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's that cat. It takes a minute to get started, but sometimes games can. Oh God, sometimes they can take an hour and a half or so to get going.
Right.
Yeah.
With this, knowing that, all right, we have hard and fast time frame, and everyone knew when everyone was on board, that helped out a lot.
Yeah.
Right. In a weird way, I actually also thought that having that character introduction that we did,
Mm-hmm.
having that almost as sort of a ritual, helped get the game
Get us
going and started. Most games have that kind of ritual of this is the ritual of beginning the game.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely.
We are here. We are here. I am Phil, but I am playing a Nora.
Yeah.
And getting into that mindset, I mean, that was a great way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely think I was really happy with the way that the pre-show section turned out. I wasn't entirely sure, even right up until when we did the first one at the show, whether it was going to work, whether it was going to communicate.
I thought it worked really well.
But yeah, I think it worked really well. I was trying to sort of take it sort of a notch away from performance, and to take it a little bit more towards the kind of casual side of we're all just showing up to do this thing, and then it's over, and then we just head. And I do think it ended up working.
Yeah.
The lighting helped with that a lot. The fact that the fluorescents were still on during the pre-show, and then they got turned off when the show itself started.
Yeah.
It was a really nice way for us all to kind of center ourselves, and get back on the same page, see what everyone's doing, and then set up. I do think it helps to have that kind of a ritual, and the idea that everything starts in the tavern.
Right, that was also really helpful.
No matter what was happening at the end of last session, we're just going to sort of, fast forward through, and okay, now we're starting the next thing.
Yeah.
Episodic style.
Exactly. Actually, I thought it was really funny. when we went to see the Knights of the Arcade comedy show, how similar in structure it was to what we were doing.
Yeah,
We
I
didn't even
agree.
we had no idea that this thing even existed. But they start in a tavern. They go for about an hour and 15 minutes, and then they cut it off. And they do a very similar sort of Monster of the Week kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, but it always starts the same way, and it always, you know, they were also being very focused, and very, you know, say your joke, whatever it is,
And then continue on. Don't dwell on things.
But yeah, so I was struck by that when we went to see them, how similar in structure and in tone what they were doing was. Yeah. I could, you know, you were mentioning before that in a regular game, it might not occur to you to do
It's true. I've never played a game that I've never been in a game or DM'd a game that's been like that. That's been a pure episodic sort of experience. It's always been, well, I have this like overarching idea, and then we have the adventure split into different pieces, and we just sort of deal with each piece as we deal with each piece, but never. This is what we're going to do, and this is how much time we have to do it in, and it has to be done by the end of this.
Right. And I was really impressed too, just within, because again, I feel like our big question mark for most of this project was can we fit this into an hour? And I feel like, for example, that show on Sunday with Drew deciding to bring a group of orcs up to the dragon.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
Which I feel like when I realized that was happening, my first thought was, I'm now worried about this because this could turn into a big thing. But it actually, even things like that, we kind of managed to rope it back on topic and
to keep it in the social scenario. And...
Right. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I wasn't going to let another fight break out.
Well,
that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. But that something like that, which, if, because I feel like that I've been in with my friends, if something like that were to happen, a fight probably would have broken out, and it probably would have gone off on a tangent for the next 3 hours before it got back to where it was supposed to.
Yeah.
So I thought it was really interesting that we could manage to kind of rope it back on topic quickly and sort of work it into the story without it feeling forced or feeling dismissive. Because that was the other thing that I was a little concerned about, was the idea that it might come off as the DM kind of dismissing things that could get confusing or could go off on a tangent.
Yeah, kind of wooden or unnatural.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think we managed to make all of that work, so that was really exciting. But yeah. Any other questions or any other things that you want to talk about? You want to bring up?
Stuff was awesome.
Stuff was
awesome. I can't brain because my office was 80 degrees, so I'm fine with answering stuff, but
right.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, everything was. I mean, what did you? I mean, Ellen, I know that you've had experience playing before, but did any of the other dancers have any feedback as to because I know as to okay, this is what we do with the game now, and this is what this means.
I think it was really interesting. I was the only dancer who had any knowledge of the game prior to this project. But I do feel like by the time the shows came around, everyone understood kind of on a basic level, level at least, because that's what we were working on, how the game would work. And sort of got an idea of what this thing was. And actually it was really interesting seeing some of their reactions the first time that they witnessed you guys playing the game. because it was actually very similar to what I remember my first reaction being, which was you don't expect the level of role playing, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Frank, you don't expect that level of, I mean, I still remember this. The first game that I played was the Magic School game that you were running.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. He had to bring me into the story somehow. And so we were sitting at the table, and the first thing that happens is Josh turns to me and says, "So you're sitting in your room, and you hear a knock at the door." And then he just sort of stops and looks at me.
And you're like,
Dude,
line?
talk? But so there was this really interesting, like, I think that's what I wasn't expecting.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like the dancers had similar reactions, but they weren't expecting the storytelling aspect of it. They weren't expecting we are all going to contribute things that we are doing. Which, it was part of the reason why I wanted to do the project in the first place, because I found that fascinating. But yeah, like the first couple of times that, I'm trying to remember, I actually think maybe the first exposure that the dancers had to it was I took an audio recording of one of your Sunday sessions.
Right.
And I turned it on, and we sort of sat there listening to it for the first one just to kind of figure out how it worked. And so the dancers were kind of looking like wide-eyed at what was going on, and we were like, is this how the game goes? Is this what this is? This is cool. So I thought it was really interesting that, yeah, they all started out completely blank slate, had no idea anything about the game, and they really enjoyed it. They really thought it was a really cool concept. And I think that's the thing, is that tabletop gaming is a really interesting concept. And, just the sort of mixture of storytelling and game mechanics and chance. It's a really interesting combination of things. I mean, to throw chance into this idea in the first place,
right?
That, mixing storytelling and game mechanics is weird enough.
Yeah.
You're telling me now that I have to rationalize why I just rolled a 1? That all of a sudden adds another level onto it. So it was really interesting to see the dancers sort of becoming more used to what was going on and sort of understanding the game more and getting to the point where it didn't feel like as much for them to remember anymore, because they just sort of understood it.
Yeah.
And it was easier too, I think, based on the feedback that I got from the dancers. They found it easier to remember what they were supposed to do next when they listened to the story that you guys were telling. Because, getting to that spot in the middle of a combat, hearing the roll, hearing the word success, is more confusing than the following, you hit it with your hammer, broadside it with your hammer, and it goes crashing to the floor.
Right.
That they can go, oh, I'm the one with the hammer, you're going down. So they were sort of working off of both levels, which I think made it a lot easier for them to understand what they were supposed to do. Definitely, by the time we were doing the shows, it didn't feel like too much for them to remember.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that was really exciting. And I mean, my dancers are such good sports about this sort of thing, because, I mean, this is what we do in the company, is we start a new project and it's probably something they've never heard of. And we go way more in depth than you would expect a dance company to care about. And then eventually they sort of understand where my brain was when I decided this was a cool idea. And it becomes easier for them to kind of see it and work with it. But they've all been really great about just sort of diving into things that are confusing and they don't really have any reference for. So that's been really exciting. But yeah. Any other questions?
I don't have any other questions.
Okay.
You, Phil?
I got nothing right now.
All right. Well,
And it's fantastic. I mean, I'm ridiculously happy that that I got in touch with you guys and everything worked out. This was a great experience. And if you guys, if anything like this happens again, I'm totally down.
Of course,
Oh, yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
Well, that was one of our questions from earlier was actually if we would consider working with you guys again. And yeah, I mean, really the issue is, will there be an opportunity for us to do a show like this again?
Yeah.
There is, obviously.
Oh yeah.
First 4 people in the contact,
Right.
so and I would love to do this sort of thing again. We just have to find a place that would like to do it.
Yeah.
So yes, and we'll definitely try to keep the game going so we can at least keep hanging out and playing together. I need to start actually playing.
Yeah.
By the way, it's really awkward to sit at the table and not participate.
That is totally the most awkward
It's
thing in the
so
world.
weird.
A
I was
tabletop game
doing
to
that
have.
in our
Yeah.
Sunday. I was ostensibly doing research and keeping track of what was going on so that I would have ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But it was
Yeah.
awkward.
Like I just, you should be doing. No. Why are you doing? No. Just listen to that. No.
I don't have a character. What can I do? So,
Change Ian's dice rolls. What? That was an 18 a second ago. Now it's
now it's a 2.
That's a 2. Oh, well, I guess I rolled a 2.
Just a 1. But, yeah, well, thanks for participating.
Yep.
In the live stream. I think
Thank you.
it was certainly a
You're very welcome. Sorry. We can blame wonderful Pittsburgh traffic.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Definitely, it's better to do this right after the show when everyone's still around, but we
Yeah, but
we
sometimes
couldn't do
that
that
couldn't
for the
happen.
festival, so this is a
Yeah.
and then it'll be should be up on the web if people want to watch it.
People want to watch it, yeah. And if you're
Yeah.
watching after the fact, thank you for watching.
Right, exactly. Yeah, better late than never. So, yeah, and I have I posted a survey, an online survey, on our Facebook page because I had an audience participation or an audience response survey that people were supposed to get along with their programs, but most of the people didn't get programs because the ushers handed them to me. So.
I'll throw it up on I'll throw it up on the Twitter because.
Yeah, so if anybody came to the show, I would really appreciate them taking a few minutes to put up surveys. Mostly how they heard about it, so I know where to spend our promotional money, and also how well we're accomplishing our mission. Since the mission of Geek Stance is to get people who are interested in the subject material but wouldn't necessarily think about it. And I know from talking to some people after the show that I did get a lot of those responses of, I've never been to a dance concert before, but I loved it and I would totally come back. So that's the ideal. So there's a couple questions about that on the survey, but real quick, just 10 questions. And it would really help us figure out whether we're making the best use of our fundraising dollars.
Right.
So, yeah. So, I think we can call this Q&A completed. We got some good questions, had some good discussions.
All right.
Thank you for watching.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me as always.
All right.
All right, we're stopping the broadcast now.
Later.
Later.